Welcome to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Whether you're 25 or 45, there's bound to be a discussion that you care about. Our mission is to share practical ways to find God in your everyday life. And now today's host, Chris Lang.
Recent studies indicate that a growing number of people, including young adults, are increasingly dissatisfied and even exhausted with their work. Company layoffs during these tough economic times mean a smaller staff producing more with less, taking on extra assignments that might even be outside of your interest zone. Your job benefits may be getting cut, and oh, by the way, your boss may not even show appreciation for you either. But what about workers in the Christian church? Pastors, office staff, and volunteers can't possibly endure the same sort of stress, can they? Hi, I'm Chris Lang, and today's topic is beating the burnout cycle. Today we're going to discuss this frequent problem within the church and its connection to the declining congregations in the U.S. and in Europe. My guest today is Ann Jackson. She is an author of a new book called Mad Church Disease, Overcoming the Burnout Epidemic. Ann is married, and she's also the writer of a very popular Christian blog called flowerdust.net. Welcome, Ann, to the program today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to see you. You are joining us from the Nashville, Tennessee area today.
I am. It's very cold here.
Well, tell us, what is it like being asked, you're a young adult. How is it that a young adult knows anything about burnout?
That's probably one of the most frequently asked questions I get. I wrote the book when I was 27, 28 years old, and, I've met so many people throughout the course of talking about it, and that's one question is, how do you know anything about burnout? You're a baby. And although that may be true, and I'm pushing 30 now, so I appreciate that compliment. I've grown up in the church. So my dad was a pastor, and I've been in church since I can remember. So really, I kind of have 30 years of experience behind that. But at the same time, I think that overall, it doesn't matter how old you are. Burnout, if you're not taking care of yourself spiritually or physically, it can hit anybody at any age. And that's exactly what happened to me.
Well, let's start at the beginning for you. I mean, I was, and by the way, for those of you watching, and if you're listening on the radio, by the way, come to our website and watch this on a podcast at hopeonfire.org. This book, Ann's book, Mad Church Disease, is available on our website, hopeonfire.org. So come take a look and pick up a copy of the book. It's great. In the very beginning, you talk about where this all began, this sort of kernel of passion for you in the church. From a personal standpoint, how did this all start for you?
Well, as I said earlier, I grew up a preacher's kid, so I saw the church and the politics and everything from a very young age. And I noticed that as my dad was in ministry more and more and more, he became more withdrawn, he became more depressed, he was gone from our family more. And I was probably about 10 years old at the time, and I had to figure out what it was that was causing my dad to kind of just change his personality altogether. And what I decided to do was to spy on one of his deacons meetings. So they had a monthly deacons meeting. Yeah, it was espionage, fourth grade espionage. But
Nice.
I'd watched Nancy Drew and read Nancy Drew books, so I was all about spying and stuff, and set up a little fort back in the fellowship hall of where this deacons meeting was, and I saw the worst thing go down. Literally deacons screaming at each other, screaming at my father, calling him liar for things that he wasn't lying about. And I left before the meeting was over, but I was just so angry and went back home, laid in my bed. My mom never knew that I had escaped for this espionage, and I just laid there in my bed just as a 10-year-old with this burning pit in my heart saying, something is not right. Because I've grown up in the church, I've learned about love, I've learned about Christ, I've learned about grace. And what I saw in that meeting did not exemplify any of those things. And so that's where this tension kind of came in.
You know, there's an expectation in the church, and you mentioned this in your book, and I think it's notable at this stage, because here you were as a young 10-year-old girl watching the stress your father was going through and bringing it home and sharing it with your mom and crying, hearing your mom cry in their bedroom. And this stress, this idea that, or maybe certainly a lie of the devil, the more hours, the harder you work, equals better Christian or higher commitment to God. You know, what was that all about, and how did that sort of lie break down for you?
Well, I don't know exactly what my father experienced in that realm, but I know for me personally, when I got into ministry, I thought that the more I worked for God or the more I did things for him, then the more I would be worthy of his love, which is not grace at all. None of us are worthy of his love. The cross is there, and that's why, you know, he can look at us. But somehow I think just within our human nature and the way that Satan tempts us, plus just our cultural influence of being super productive, we have all these new technology and new tools that we can just go 24/7. And that's not the way that, you know, we were created. We weren't created to go 24/7. We were created to rest in the fact that God is taking care of us, and we can accomplish his purpose that way. So doing things for God and being with God are two very different things. And if you do things for God, it's a real easy path to burnout.
Now, Anne, you made a deal with God when you were 16 years old. You kind of, like a lot of us do, we kind of come to the end of yourself, and you were frustrated, and you prayed a pretty mature prayer. What kind of a deal did you try to strike with God?
That I was coming out of a business meeting, which was very similar to the deacons meeting that I was in a few years before that, and big fights, and I ran out of the church and slammed the door and ran up this fire escape outside the church, and I wrote this letter to God, and I just said, there is no unity in this church. If you will give me some way of bringing unity to the church, I'll do that. Like, that will be my life commitment. But you've got to show me a way, or I'm just going to give up on this altogether. So it's kind of an ultimatum, like, you show me a way to give unity to the church, or I don't believe this anymore and I'm out. And he didn't really show up in a way that I expected him to.
Now, you mentioned that the answer took several years to come in your life, in your journey, about 5 years later. But in that 5-year period, you went through a bit of a wilderness journey, didn't you? You kind of
Absolutely.
You said you unplugged, basically, and got rid of Jesus in your life. What happened to you?
I did. I saw, I figured since he didn't answer the question, and my dad lost his job, we had to move, we had to uproot. My parents got into debt significantly because my dad wasn't able to find another job. So all of these things just happened, and I thought, how could God let this happen to somebody that he loves and he cares about? So I just decided that there probably wasn't a God, and I lived my life in such a manner that you know, showed that. I got addicted to a lot of different things, started drinking a lot, I abused prescription medicine, I started entering into unhealthy relationships with men and partying a lot, and just kind of, I mean, I rebelled. If you looked at it, it would be the classic preacher's kid, you know, rebellion. But at the core of it, I think I knew that God was still there pursuing me, because I would cry out to him in those really desperate moments. But again, for the most part, I would just look at my family and say, God abandoned us.
You said that you would come home. You actually moved out, and you watched how your dad just got so discouraged that was part of what broke your heart, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. I was 17, barely 17 years old when I moved out. So I had graduated high school early, accelerated that process because I couldn't stand to live in the house anymore because it was just so heavy living there and seeing my father like that and seeing how it was affecting my mom, and I have a younger brother as well. So it was too much for me to bear.
Now you had a friend come and share an apartment with you when you were in your 21 or so. God sent you someone to start encouraging you. What happened to you when she started dragging you out of bed to go to church, and what God started showing you He had a plan for your life, didn't He?
Definitely. My best friend Julie, and we had been friends since the church that my dad left. So I mean, since we were in junior high and high school, we'd been friends. She decided to move to Dallas, became my roommate, and assumed naturally that we would go to church. And after a night of partying, she asked where I went to church, and I'm just like mumbling under my breath, just don't go to church anywhere, leave me alone. So she eventually got me to start going to church with her a couple of times. Oh, I went, but mainly she was just there to listen and to love on me a little bit. And she was with me. I was in a car accident when I was 21, and that was really the turning point, because it was one of those car wrecks where you walk away from and you look at what happened and you think, I should have died. There was no reason I should be free. Like, we didn't have a scratch on us, and she was with me in that, and we just decided, you know what, let's just go get a fresh start somewhere. So we moved to Kansas City and started getting plugged into a church there, and that's kind of where the calling began again.
So you got involved after a series of events. You felt God showing you that He wanted you to work at this particular church, but then you started to experience your own type of burnout, didn't you?
Absolutely. I loved my job. I started volunteering there in the student ministry. Then that turned into an actual vocational position, and loved it. I mean, I loved working with kids. Our team was awesome. And sometimes when you love something so much, you chase it very passionately, and you don't feel like you need a break from it. And that's kind of where I was. I was just running and running and running and loving it. And if, my husband's like, you need to take some time off, you need to take some breaks. And I just was like, no, I'm fine. I'm, at the time, 23, 24 years old, I can handle this. And I didn't know I was getting exhausted.
Nonstop energy.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that without taking a break, it would just build up and eventually catch up to me. And that's exactly what happened. I ended up changing positions into an actual much more demanding position. And probably 6 months into that, so about 2 years or so into my vocational ministry, I ended up in the hospital. I mean, I went from at work and really healthy to flat on my back, being admitted through the emergency room, and then into the hospital so that they could run tests on me.
Wow! So you worked so hard that you basically ended up flat on your back.
Yeah, my body responded to the stress with inflammation. So they initially thought it was appendicitis, which anybody can get. It doesn't have anything to do with stress or burnout. But once they started doing the tests, they're like, well, your appendix is fine, but you have all this inflammation inside, kind of your abdominal organs, and they weren't healthy and they weren't responding in the way that they should. So they kept running test after test after test, and you don't have cancer, you don't have Crohn's disease or gallbladder disease, your appendix is fine, your stomach's fine. I mean, for a week they ran these tests. And so finally one doctor said, how is your stress level? And that was kind of the killer question right there.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after this break. You're listening to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Welcome back. I'm Chris Lang, your host on Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. I'm joined today in the studio via webcam by my new friend Ann Jackson, who is author of a book that we're talking about today, Mad Church Disease, Overcoming the Burnout Epidemic. And before the break, you were talking about the physical trauma that you went through, and you actually were hospitalized. Mm-hmm. How long was it until you recognized that it was stress and burnout that did that to you?
Well, it really wasn't very long after. I mean, once the doctor said there's nothing wrong with the functions of any of these organs, that we think stress is causing this inflammation and your body's responding physically to the stress. I went home and took a couple weeks leave of absence from my job just to kind of process what had happened, and also not just the physical component of it, but mentally and emotionally, without really thinking about it. I had been having panic attacks. I had been going through seasons of depression, and I was just writing this off as just oh, Satan's attacking me, oh, this is natural, oh, this is to be expected, when it's not. That's a sign, it's a symptom that something's wrong. Relationally, I had completely withdrawn from so many relationships because in ministry, it seems like we have to have this, we have everything together sort of mentality in order to perform for God or to perform God's work. And so I was not being open about what I was going through, thinking, I would lose my job, I would lose my check, I would lose my responsibility, my purpose, all these different things. But my husband is a very wise man and helped me see kind of the areas in my life that I needed to scale back on, draw some boundaries around, and really the root of it all is to get spiritually healthy again. Because I had neglected that relationship, everything else went out of whack. Just completely. So that was kind of the turning point. And it took a couple of weeks to just really process that with a counselor and with my husband. But it was a necessary thing to do.
So when did you start thinking about writing a book about this?
Well, probably since I left, I ended up leaving that church that I was at about 4 or 5 months after I was in the hospital, just because the environment there was not able to adapt to the new boundaries that I had established. So I started looking around and realizing there were a lot of people that I knew in ministry at different churches and through the just internet and social media. You're reading people's blogs, and people were getting burned out, whether it was a physical thing or if it was depression or emotional or relational. There were different elements, and I realized I wasn't the only one. So I created a website for people to share their stories on it. And within just a couple of days, we had over 1,000 people share their stories, which was just insane. I mean, there was no advertising, there was no publicity campaign. It was all word of mouth. But because so many people related to that issue and they were able to share anonymously, we didn't ask for any of that information about where they worked or what they did. That was kind of their way of just venting and letting this emotion and this frustration and confusion out. And I looked around online to see if there were any resources, and there weren't a whole lot. And so writing is a love of mine. I thought, there's no real resource out there. I've experienced it. There's a lot of people experiencing it. Why not develop a resource that can help them? And so that's kind of how the book was born.
That's awesome. And I mean, how could you have known sitting in the hospital that, having your own personal experience, in addition to seeing it happen to your father, to be able to speak from personal experience at such a young age, you come out and you start writing this book. What are the risk factors and symptoms of burnout in your book? Why don't you kind of summarize and break that down for our audience today?
Oh, definitely. There's lots of risk factors, both internal and external. And these things don't necessarily mean that you're going to get burned out. They're just kind of things that if you have these in your life, just kind of warning flags to watch. Internally, just taking an assessment of your own health, your physical health. Are you sleeping right? Are you experiencing headaches? Are you feeling sick? Are you feeling fatigued? Those are not normal things, and they might indicate something else. Also, your personal history. My history was one where I came out of really bad church experiences, and your history shapes who you are. So you have to kind of look at your history and say, what about this is going to maybe put me into a category where I can burn out? And most importantly, internally, how is your relationship with Christ? Again, it boils down to that. People try and prioritize things kind of in a hierarchy. We put God first, and then our spouse, and our kids, and then our work. But I don't think that's really a proper way of doing that. I think it's more of like a wheel, and God's at the center. And then you have all of these other things rotating around that center. But if you're not balanced and you're not communing with God on a frequent basis, not just doing things for Him, not just reading the Bible because you have to preach or teach, but really evaluate your relationship with Christ, that's a huge internal thing to do. Externally, this is kind of where it gets a little tricky, is there are definite environmental things. If you're working in a church that your values and the church's values don't align necessarily, that could cause a big problem. If it's little things, here and there, you're not always going to agree with everything. That's normal. But if there are big value differences between what you believe and what the church believes, that is, you need to evaluate if you need to be there or not. That's very key. Expectations, if you have unclear expectations and you're just kind of working and you don't know why, that could be part of the burnout. Communication, church politics, those really ugly things are all risk factors for burning out externally. But you can't always just point the finger out. You have to take a look inside as well, and evaluate both internally and externally what those risk factors are.
That has to be a really honest self-assessment, doesn't it, with prayer? Because what you just said is, I think, very telling. The internal and the external assessment needs to be done together, because sometimes people might point a finger outward when in reality they're not living in a balanced way themselves, right?
Oh, definitely. And that was exactly what I did when I was going through this. You know, I was really young and really immature. And so, of course, I'm blaming my boss who makes me work late. I'm blaming, the church is exploding and I have all these responsibilities. And, God is not going to meet people at this church if I don't show up, and that weight. But if I had just really been talking and spending time in my relationship with Christ, listening to what he was requiring from me, then I probably would have noticed the external warning signs long before I did, and that might have saved myself and that church a lot of grief that we ended up going through.
You talk about 5 principles for recovery and avoiding these cycles of burnout. Break down those 5 recovery elements and give kind of your personal assessment of each one.
Oh, definitely. I think the first thing you have to do, and this is the point that I came to, was realizing you have to own up. You have to own up that it's not just somebody else's fault, that you do have, I was the one choosing to eat poorly. I gained 40 pounds in the 2 years that I was in ministry, and I'm not going to blame the church for that. They weren't force feeding me, Krispy Kreme and Taco Bell.
You mean the cafeteria didn't have donuts in it?
No, we were at a Baptist church then, so there was lots of food, but I still made those decisions. So it's making, taking responsibility for the things that I did neglect time with my spouse and time with God, and ate poorly and slept poorly and made really bad decisions. So owning up is the first thing to, I think, just acknowledging the fact that you might be burning out. That's kind of that one. The second one is to look at your purpose and change your purpose. People always think, I'm supposed to be a teacher, I'm supposed to be a preacher, I'm supposed to be a graphic designer, and that's your purpose in life. And I don't really buy into that. I think those are your talents and where you're gifted. But I think we have one universal purpose as believers, and that's to love God and love our neighbor as ourself. And I think many times we neglect the as ourself part of that, and we focus on love God, love your neighbor. But he says it 7 times in the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself. So making sure that we're seeking the kingdom first, that's our purpose, and then letting our work and our skills and our talents and our gift work as an overflow from that is probably the next thing there.
Gotcha.
Another one is to make a plan. That was something that was really key for me to get out of that cycle of burnout. Was, okay, I'm not healthy physically, so what do I need to do? I need to lose weight. And I made a plan for me physically, made a plan for me emotionally. I started seeing a therapist. I highly recommend counseling or therapy. There's such a stigma that can be attached to that.
I agree.
And even taking medication for some things.
Yeah.
That is all fine and dandy, and it will help you get out of a spot. So definitely find a safe place to talk about something, but make that plan emotionally. Spiritually, same thing. It's not becoming a routine about, I have to have my quiet time today, I have to pray today. It's just getting into that prayer that never ceases, just that living in the moment with Christ, your creator, making a plan for that, and relationally being very intentional, being very open about where you're struggling with your spouse, with your friends, finding some safe places where you can have those relationships. The fourth thing is to find accountability. And I think I hate that word, to be honest with you, because it's become misused in our culture. We think accountability is just going to Starbucks and sitting down with someone and saying, this is where I've sinned, this is where I've screwed up this week, and the other person said, this is where I've screwed up this week. Right. But That's not it. It's really having a covenant relationship with somebody, that you give them full access to your life. You give them the permission to ask you questions, the hard questions, the questions that might offend you. You know, I have a friend that has access to my calendar. She has access to my email, pretty much every area of my life she can look at. And if she sees that, you know, I'm really, really busy for several weeks, she's not asking me like, oh, why are you busy for several weeks? But why? Like, what's the motivation behind you, you know, scheduling these meetings? You know, are you looking for some affirmation? Are you trying to find familiar? So it's letting her ask those questions and then being open and honest with her and expressing those things. So finding accountability is huge.
We have 1 minute left.
Okay.
At Seventh-day Adventists, we love worshiping on the Bible Sabbath. And it's one of the things that I noticed at the end of your book, that you make a beautiful pitch for the rest that the Sabbath rest that God offers us provides. What has that meant to you in your journey?
That's simply meant resting in the fact that I know that the cross has saved me from everything, that nothing I can do will make me holier in Christ's eyes, nothing that I can say or produce will, that the cross is the one thing that's there that covers me, and that I just need to rest in that and allow that relationship, the fruit from that relationship is what God desires from us. He wants us to be a holy and living sacrifice. He doesn't ask us to sacrifice anything else except ourselves to Him.
Thanks so much for joining us today. God bless you all, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on Hope on Fire.
Hope on Fire is produced by Livestreams Media, a listener-supported ministry. To download a free copy of today's program or be a part of our social network, please visit our website at hopeonfire.org. You may also contact us by writing to Livestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860, or online at hopeonfire.org. Thank you so much for your letters and continued support. Until next time, may God set your hope on fire.